Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to review the Wisconsin lobbying laws with us. We're providing this recorded webinar, this recorded training for those of you that could not attend our last training online or in person. So myself, Caroline Russell, and I'm here with Colette Ranke. We're going to go over some general lobbying law basics and best practices. But as always, if you have any questions that are not directly covered in this material, you should contact us with any questions that you might have, and we can give you confidential advice. So first, to start off with, I would like to go over a little bit about the Ethics Commission and who the commissioners are. Just to give you some context, these are our 6 ethics commissioners right now. You can see who they're appointed by and their term limits. They're a pretty diverse group. We've got 2 judges, and then we have 4 different appointees from various backgrounds, and they each come from different political parties. So it's not completely not biased in one way or another. There have not been any 3-3 votes on anything, and we rarely have any votes that are deadlocked or that are like a 4-2 vote. Most of the time, all the votes are unanimous consent. And here are all of the current Ethics Commission staff. We have our new administrator, Daniel Carlton Jr. He began working with us in the beginning of September. And we also have a new ethics specialist named Harry Broderick. He also started at the same time as our new administrator. But this is our entire program staff. And we like to point out that there's only 5 program staff. So when you do call us around a deadline date, it is important to perhaps call us earlier in advance because these are the 5 people that are going to be answering your questions. So if everybody waits until the deadline, it's going to be a little bit harder for us to address your questions and get back to you as soon as possible. And so today we're just going to cover exactly what Wisconsin lobbying law is, some definitions just for some clarification. We'll go over registration, reporting, and restrictions. And also noteworthy changes. There are a couple of changes to the Eye on Lobbying website itself and how certain things will be reported and how registration will be going into the 2019-2020 legislative session. So we would just like to go over those and give those a little bit of extra time. So first, I like to bring up this cartoon. We have it in most of our ethics and lobbying trainings, and it is from Harpers Weekly in 1858, and it's kind of discussing how it was well known that politicians in Wisconsin could be bought at the time because there was a scandal with the governor, Coles Bashford. He actually ended up fleeing the state, but he was implicated in an investigation. So was the Wisconsin Supreme Court at the time, and most of the legislature. They all received bribes totaling, I believe it was above $11 million in today's money, so the equivalent of $11 million today, for giving or approving land grants to a railroad company. And so there was an investigation after the land grants were approved, and it was found, all of this money was given to these Wisconsin politicians, Supreme Court justices, and the governor himself. So it became pretty well known that Wisconsin politicians could be bought. And so that gave us essentially the very first iteration of the lobbying law in the state of Wisconsin. We come to the sort of preamble to subchapter 3 of chapter 13 of the Wisconsin statutes, which is the lobbying law.
So the lobbying law, the intent behind the statutes is that we want to make sure that the people are afforded the opportunity to petition their government, but we also want to make sure that we're preserving the integrity of the governmental decision-making process and regulating it in a proper manner. So making sure that we're making everything transparent and being able to show the public what's going on behind the scenes, who is trying to influence legislative and administrative action, and who is being influenced. So that's kind of just the intent behind the lobbying statute. So who is a lobbyist? What is lobbying? That's the first step we need to take in our analysis of are you lobbying? Are you a lobbyist? Are you a principal? So first of all, lobbying is attempting to influence legislative or administrative action by oral or written communication with any elective state official, agency official, and legislative employee. This includes your time spent preparing for such communications and appearances at public hearings or meetings or service on a committee in which that preparation would occur. Lobbying does not include those seeking a contract or a grant or quasi-judicial decisions. So if you're bidding on a contract, that is not going to be considered lobbying. But if you're attempting to influence legislation or administrative rules, then that is going to be considered lobbying. And when you are making those communications or doing that preparation, you are actively lobbying. Okay, now we get to who is a lobbyist. Wisconsin statutes have a very structured definition of who a lobbyist is. A lobbyist under statute is an individual who is employed by or receives compensation from a principal for the purpose of lobbying on behalf of that principal, and they either make communications if their duties are limited exclusively to the statutory definition of lobbying, or they make communications on at least 5 days within a reporting period if their duties are not exclusively limited to the statutory definition of lobbying. So if you are employed by a principal, but you have other duties that have to do with consulting and public relations, maybe something with campaign finance work, then you're going to be in that second category. Your duties are not exclusively limited to the statutory definition of lobbying. You may have the title of a lobbyist, but under the statutes, you are allowed to communicate at least 4 times before you actually have to have your license and be authorized by a principal. If you are a lobbyist whose duties are limited to the statutory definition, so you are only attempting to influence legislation or administrative rulemaking, then you have to have your license right away, and you have to be authorized right away before you can begin engaging in lobbying activity. It's a little different from what happens practically. A lot of lobbyists are going to register and be authorized before those 5 days, which is completely acceptable, but you are not required to under the statutes. So it's certainly okay to get your license before those 5 instances of lobbying communications, or have your authorization done by then. It's just not required under statute. Some other things about who a lobbyist is. A lobbyist is a person that can't be delinquent on taxes, child support, or unemployment insurance compensation. And it also excludes unpaid volunteers, because you have to actually be paid to be a lobbyist, or individuals that only are receiving expense reimbursements. One thing to note is that this is a very rare circumstance, but we do have limited lobbying principals. They may have lobbyists, and they are also considered lobbyists and therefore subject to the prohibitions that any other lobbyist would be subject to.
Additionally, the reporting periods that we refer to when we talk about lobbying communications on each of at least 5 days within a reporting period. Throughout a legislative session, we have reporting periods of 6 months. They cover activity from January to June and July to December. So if you're having lobbying communications on each of at least 5 days in between, say, January to June, then by your 5th communication, you'll need to get licensed and all of that stuff that we will go over in just a couple of slides.
Okay, so what is a lobbying communication? Lobbying communication is referred to in the definition of a lobbyist. So what exactly is that? Lobbying communication is an oral or written communication with any agency official, elective state official, a legislative employee, and that needs to be attempting to influence legislation or administrative action. So this excludes communicating with your legislators in a personal capacity, mass communications through the media, requests for information from the legislature or any legislative employees. So if a state official is just requesting information on a certain subject that is covered by your principal, that's just a request for information, and as long as you're communicating back purely informational material or providing informational material, it is not lobbying communication. Also, participation as a member in deliberations of a committee of the legislature, and there's several other ones that are a little more rare. So the main ones are those top 3. The mass communications through the media is more of grassroots lobbying, and the communicating with legislators in a personal capacity just means that anytime you are personally about a subject you care about, talking to your legislator, that is okay. That's not considered a lobbying communication unless you start talking about something on behalf of your principal.
And if you have any questions, if you're unsure of what you're doing or what you want to do on behalf of your principal is or is not a lobbying communication, please contact us. Just give us a call, send us an email, and we can give you a response pretty quickly. And that way we can give you peace of mind that what you are doing either is or is not a lobbying communication, and you have that contact, that email, that written response to fall back on if anybody gives you any questions about it or if anyone files any complaints about it.
So we're going to talk about lobbying communication in 2 separate ways in this training. We just went over lobbying communication as it relates to the definition of a lobbyist, and when you have to become when you have to be licensed as a lobbyist and authorized as a lobbyist by a principal. So that's highlighted in this blue box, the 5-day threshold for lobbyist license. Later on, we're going to talk more about lobbying communication in terms of time reporting. These are 2 different types of communication. So we're going to judge communication in different manners depending on what we're looking at. So for the purpose of the 5-day threshold for your lobbyist license, we're going to be looking at any 1 or 2-way communication. So it's communication that doesn't require dialogue back and forth or any conversational communication. This can be just sending off an email, leaving a voicemail, sending a letter. Those are instances of lobbying communication for the purpose of counting towards that 5-day threshold to get your lobbyist license. So if you, on 3 different occasions, send an email or send a letter, then those are going to be 3 times that count towards you getting that lobbyist license and requiring to have it. Lobbyist time reporting, as we'll discuss later on, is more so the back and forth conversation that you have with a state official. So that's going to come in in-person meetings and phone calls, conversational messages, electronic messaging. So if you're texting back and forth or if you're shooting off emails and getting a reply back like a minute later and then sending another one, that would also be considered something that you'd be time reporting. It's going to exclude de minimis amount of times, so something like just shooting off an email and you don't get a reply fly back for a couple of days. You can't really include that. It's clicking send, and that second really doesn't get included. The preparation and drafting of writing the email would be something that would need to be reported, but again, we'll talk about that later on in the training.
And again, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention in the beginning of this presentation that the noteworthy changes throughout the slides. We've placed kind of blue boxes around things that correlate to those noteworthy changes. So far we've discussed the exclusive and non-exclusive to statutory lobbying definitions, and so that's something that we're going to go over a little bit more. But we've kind of tried to put blue boxes around things that are pretty noteworthy and that we wanted to put emphasis on. So if you see a blue box or a blue arrow around something, just know that is something that we will go over a little bit at the end and summarize it. But that's something that is new. It will be new for the 2019-2020 legislative session, and we want to make sure that everyone is very clear on those things.
So now on to what is a lobbying principal. So a principal is any person who employs a lobbyist. You can be an individual and be a principal. That's fairly rare, but it certainly can happen. Most principals are going to be organizations, so sometimes we will refer to them as just lobbying organizations instead of principal. But this is not like a lobbying firm. They're not considered the principal. It's the actual organization that is asking the lobbyists to lobby on behalf of them. So the ones that want the legislative changes or administrative rule changes. There are full lobbying principals, which is the majority of lobbying principals. And then there's also limited lobbying principals. This is fairly rare. You will not be spending over $500 if you're a limited lobbying principal. And we just ask that if you think you may have a limited lobbying principal, that you contact staff just to double check so we can go over what your expenses will be and just to make sure that you do fit in that category. And again, anybody representing you as a lobbyist, if you're a limited lobbying principal, you're subject to the same prohibitions as any other lobbyist that works for a full lobbying principal.
And so the next section that we're going to go through are the 3 R's of lobbying: registration, reporting, and restrictions, starting with who needs to register and obtain a license. So for lobbyist licenses, part-time, full-time lobbyists need to obtain licenses, but at different times. So there might be an individual that is engaging in lobbying activity, but they're not required to yet because they haven't met specific thresholds. So as we discussed earlier, as Colette said, an individual who for compensation communicates with officials for the purpose of lobbying on 5 or more days in a 6-month reporting period, and whose duties are not limited to the statutory definition of lobbying. So they need to obtain their registration by that 5th date of communication within the 6-month reporting period. Or if you are only engaging in, if your duties are limited to the statutory definition of lobbying, so attempting to influence legislative or administrative action only, then you need to obtain your license prior to engaging in that activity, so prior to having that specific communication. And then a principal is any person who employs a lobbyist, so kind of they depend on each other, the lobbyist registration, or the principal registration and the lobbyist licenses. And we'll go over the order in which you should do that when we cover reporting. And so, again, for extra emphasis, the registration requirement. If your duties are not limited exclusively to the statutory definition of lobbying, exclusively to influencing legislative or administrative action, then on the 5th day of lobbying communication within a 6-month period, you must be licensed and you must be authorized, and the principal must be registered. If at any point you realize that you've registered after, or you've had too many communications and you are not registered yet, you should really contact us right away. It's better to be registered a little bit late than not at all. It would be likely that somebody could file a complaint if you're engaging in a lot of lobbying activity, and we want to avoid that situation. We want to get to the entire point of the lobbying law, which is integrity, transparency of the decision-making process. And so furthermore, if your duties are limited exclusively to influencing legislative or administrative action, then you need to register, the principal needs to register, and you need to get your license before there are any lobbying communications whatsoever. So again, if you realize that this has not been the case for you, that you've had lobbying communications and you should have already obtained your license, contact us, and we can put something down in our audit notes that you sort of self-reported, and we can make sure that the commission is aware of that if any enforcement action does come up. But the whole point of this is that you can register early in order to avoid the possibility that you could go over the communications threshold. And registration for the 2019-2020 legislative session opens on December 1st of 2018. You should be prepared to pay your fees, though, within 15 days of submitting those applications. We'll go over that a little bit more when we talk about settlement schedules later on. And so we do have a couple of scenarios, a couple of sort of quiz questions to go over just to help you all understand how the registration and reporting requirements works. So in this first scenario, a principal has 2 employees that spend a portion of their time on lobbying activity in addition to their other job duties. Within a 6-month reporting period, one person communicates with legislators about a bill on 4 occasions, and the other communicates about a bill on 3 occasions. So in this scenario, we're going to assume that these communications are on behalf of the principal, and we're going to assume that because the first sentence says, in addition to their other job duties, that their duties to the principal are not exclusive only to the statutory definition of lobbying. So they're not exclusive only to influencing legislative and administrative action on behalf of that principal. So in this scenario, who is required to obtain a lobbying license or principal registration? And the answer is nobody, because each of the employees are underneath that 5 communication threshold within a 6-month reporting period. They are getting kind of close, though, so they should consider getting their licenses ahead of perhaps that first person having their 5th communication, just to make sure that they have all their bases covered. And so our second scenario, there is a business that contracts with a governmental affairs specialist to represent it and their interests, to communicate with legislators monthly about the effects of legislation and the effects that it has on their industry's productivity. And so here we have communication that's happening monthly, and so who would be required to get licensed and registered and when? So the governmental affairs specialist should get a lobbying license, a lobbyist license, because if they're communicating monthly, that's 6 times within a 6-month reporting period, which is over the 5 communication threshold. And then the business then should register as a lobbying principal and authorize the governmental affairs specialist, now lobbyist. And so in this scenario, we also assumed that the governmental affairs specialist is doing other activity other than just making lobbying communications on behalf of the principal, as tends to be the case with governmental affairs specialists. But it could be possible that a principal does hire a specialist only to do lobbying communications and work towards lobbying. And so our next portion is the registration and what you actually should be doing, the order that you should be doing it in the Eye on Lobbying website. So first, you should have your lobbyist apply for their license. And here's all of the information that the lobbying website asks them for. We do require, and actually statutes require them to submit their social security number along with their application, because that's used for checking delinquency regarding taxes, unemployment, contributions, or alimony or child care payments. And then after the lobbyist submits their application for their license, the principal should fill out the application to become a registered principal. And here is the information that will be asked on the lobbying website. For both the lobbying licenses and the principal registrations, you'll see towards the bottom usernames of those you wish to have access to the principal account, or here usernames of those you wish to have access to your lobbyist account. That's an important part of the registration, because you can add other usernames to the list of people that can access and kind of make changes or submit reports for you. So depending on the relationship that the principal and the lobbyist have, perhaps the lobbyist is the one that is submitting all the 15-day reports. So the principal will have to make sure that they give those direct permissions to the lobbyist in order to do that. If you're ever having any trouble accessing something that you think you should have access to, whether you're a principal or you're a lobbyist, you can just give us a call. We can see who has permissions to what principal account, so we can give you a definitive answer and tell you who you need to contact to get the correct permissions if you don't have them. We do not, we very rarely will change permissions of a principal ourselves. The only reason we have done so in the past, or in the past couple of years, has been if the only person with access to the principal account actually passed away or retired without putting anybody else in their place. But then we would ask for a written submission saying, stating the scenario, this person passed away and nobody has access, so we need another person to have access. Because having permissions does have legal implications, so if you're submitting documents, if you're submitting lobbyist time reports or statements of lobbying activities and expenditures, then whoever has signed those documents is legally implicated for the content of them. So we want to make sure that that we're not sharing passwords, we're not sharing usernames, and that instead we're giving permissions to the different people that need access to those things. And so step 3, which is actually a part of the principal registration, is to authorize the lobbyists that you want to be engaging in lobbying activity for you if you were the principal. And so again, we see a blue box here noting that this is some new information. And so right now, or moving forward, the authorization dates that are going to be listed will only show up if the authorization fee has been paid. We don't have any requirement for the lobbyist or the principal to pay it. Again, whoever has permissions can pay that fee, but that authorization date column will remain blank until the authorization fee has been paid and a staff member at the Ethics Commission has marked the authorization as approved. And so if you don't see a date there, you might want to contact your principal, or you can contact us and we can let you know what's going on with that. And additionally, we no longer have the lobbyist type of in-house or contract, because that information is no longer going to be collected. It wasn't specifically stated anywhere in statutes, and so we decided to take it out for sort of more accurate reporting information. So that's not going to be listed on this summary page either. And so furthermore, going into the fact that in-house and contract lobbyists is no longer going to be collected, when you are adding a lobbyist, when you're adding a lobbyist authorization to the principal registration, this is now what the screen will look like. So instead of choosing in-house or contract lobbyist, the principal is going to be designating the duties agreed upon by the principal and the lobbyist. And this is where we get to back for the definition of lobbying. So either the lobbyist's duties on behalf of the principal are exclusively limited to attempting to influence legislative or administrative action, or they are not exclusively limited. So again, that attempting to influence legislative or administrative action is the statutory definition of lobbying. And so this information is very, very important because this is what we are going to use for audits moving forward. So we have an unauthorized lobbying audit in which we look at the communications that were made and reported by lobbyists, and if they occurred prior to the authorization date or after the authorization date. And depending on the choice that you make here, if you mark that the duties are not exclusively limited, then you have perhaps 5 instances of communication that can happen by the time your authorization is approved. Or if your duties are exclusively limited to the statutory definition of lobbying, you cannot have any communications prior to the authorization date. So it's very important that you discuss with the principal, or the principal discuss with the lobbyist exactly what your duties are going to be, and make sure that the correct choice is made on this page. And further with that, when you're editing the authorized lobbyist, we are now going to display this information above on the screen, and that is to assist you with making the correct choice regarding the exclusivity of responsibilities. So when you are answering this question here, the duties agreed upon by the principal and the lobbyist, you will also see this information with the statutory citations above it to help you decide what choice to make. And then the final step, which is a necessary step, is to pay the fees that are associated with whatever application you submitted or registration you submitted. Your lobbyist license or your principal registration or authorization are not valid until we receive the fees that are associated with them. And furthermore, on February 27th at the Commission's meeting, they adopted a standard settlement schedule for the late payment of lobbying-related fees. And this means that lobbying fees that are not received within 15 days could be considered late by the Commission, and you could potentially be looking at some enforcement action from them. So we have some statutory citations there, but it's very important, especially looking at going into the new session. Registration opens on December 1st, which is a Saturday. So if you're all gung-ho and you go and fill out the information that you need to, get your lobbyists licensed and your principals registered, you need to send us in that payment. We need to be in receipt of the payment of those fees within 15 days. So if you're not prepared to pay your fees essentially right away, you might want to wait a little bit and wait to fill out that information until you are ready to pay the fees. And so again, we have a couple of question scenarios just to assist you with understanding how these things work, how we calculate them, and how you should go about doing them in the lobbying website. So in this scenario, there's a nonprofit organization that pays a staff member to lobby on behalf of its behalf as half of their normal duties, and she's paid $45,000 a year and doesn't lobby on behalf of anybody else. So what registration fees are required? So here we're going to assume that this staff member is communicating regularly, so over the 5 communication threshold within a 6-month reporting period. And we're also going to say, assuming that she is a full-time employee, so 40 hours a week. So if half of her normal duties would be about 20 hours a week, more than likely that's going to be over the 5 communication threshold within a 6-month reporting period. And so in this scenario, she needs a single lobbyist license, and then the principal needs to get registered, and then she needs to she needs to receive an authorization on behalf of that principal. So in total, that's going to be $750. And you don't have to figure this out all on your own. If you follow the steps, get the lobbyist license first, fill out the principal registration, and then add the authorization, then the lobbying site will add up all of the information for you. And so the next scenario that we have, there's a lobbying firm that employs 3 different lobbyists, and the firm itself represents 4 different lobbying principals. And each lobbyist is authorized to lobby on behalf of 2 principals. So what fees are required? So we have 3 lobbyists, and they're going to be representing more than 1 principal each. So they each need a multiple lobbyist license. And then the firm is representing 4 different lobbying principals, and they each need to be registered. And also, we have 6 different authorizations, because each lobbyist of the 3 is going to be lobbying on behalf of 2 principals. And so total, it's going to be $3,450. And again, if you follow the steps 1 through 4 of filling out the license and registrations, you should have all of your fees in total covered, so that when you send us the invoice, you don't have to worry about anything else. And so now we have our second of the 3 R's, which is reporting requirements. And we have a few different types of reporting requirements, ones that are due kind of continuously throughout the reporting period, and then ones that are due at the end of the reporting period. So 15-day reports of lobbying interests are the responsibility of the principal, and they're due continuously throughout the reporting period. So every time you're having communication on something, you're having an initial communication on something, you should be submitting 15-day reports for it. We'll go through the details on that in a little bit here. And then also we have tracking of lobbying time, communications, lobbying communications versus other types of lobbying activities. And that is due at the end of the reporting periods. So for activity from June to December, it's due on January 31st. And from activity covering January to June, that is due 1 month later on July 31st. Which are the same due dates for the statement of lobbying activities and expenditures, which is a responsibility of the principal as well. So it's important to note here that only the tracking of lobbying time is the responsibility of the lobbyist technically, but depending on the relationship that the lobbyist and the principal have, it may be the lobbyist that is submitting the 15-day reports, but statutorily, 15-day reports are the responsibility of the principal. So to go into a little bit more detail about 15-day reports of lobbying interests, so all principals, again, principals, are required to report bills, admin rules, budget bill subjects, and then topics not yet assigned a bill or rule number within 15 days of the first communication on that matter. I like to point out here that this is for the initial communication. So that means that every time that a legislative matter sort of changes its status, you have to submit another 15-day report if you're continuing to have lobbying communications on that thing. So for instance, if we have like a tax exemption for cat food that initially is included in the budget bill subjects proposal and a principal is communicating on it. Within 15 days of that first communication on the tax exemption for cat food, the principal needs to submit a 15-day report. But say it doesn't get included in the budget, and instead, it doesn't get passed in the budget, but a legislator decides to put it out as a standalone bill. So then, within 15 days of the initial communication on that standalone bill that the principal has, they need to submit another 15-day report for the tax exemption for cat food under the corresponding bill number. So, maybe AB 25. And if AB 25 fails, but this principal really wants cat food to be exempted from taxes, then it continues to lobby on that topic of tax exemption for cat food. within 15 days of their initial communication of the tax exemption for cat food as a topic, it would need to submit another 15-day report. And that 15-day report, that final one, would be for it as a topic. So things that are being drafted also, if they have an LRB number, those are reported as topics. So if it's not an administrative rule, a budget bill subject, or a legislative matter, so it has a bill number, then it's reported as a topic. And topics should include a succinct written statement that puts a member of the public on notice as to the subject matter that you're talking about. So you don't have to write an entire paragraph, but it would not be sufficient to just say taxes. But something like a tax exemption for cat food would be sufficient. That doesn't really leave anything to the imagination there. And you can also include comments. You can include other documents and attach that to your 15-day report. But make sure you're being specific when you are submitting these topics, these 15-day reports. And you can also amend the 15-day report, so you can amend the interest in legislative proposals and budget bill subjects. It's important to note that you can only amend the date within 15 days of when you originally submitted it. And also, if you submitted something on accident and you want something to be deleted, that has to be done by staff here. But it can be done pretty quickly. Just give us a call and let us know what happened, and we can go in and delete that for you. You can also send an email. That's always recommended as the best option, because then we have a very clear paper trail of exactly what happened, in case anybody questions us or questions you as to what happened to that 15-day report. But it happens when there's a lot of legislative activity going on. Sometimes numbers of bills get transposed and you're just submitting a bunch of 15-day reports at a time. So we can delete those for you if that's something that needs to be done. And so this is what a 15-day report looks like. And here's where you can enter extra comments. You can upload any files or put in, if your principal has a web page on this particular topic, you can put it in there. And so moving on to more requirements during the reporting period, and this is for the lobbyist time reports. So they need to be keeping track of a daily itemization of their time, time engaging in lobbying communication versus time engaging in essentially everything else. And lobbyists need to keep track of their time, but so do non-lobbyist employees that are engaging in lobbying activity. There's a specific place for those employees on the Statement of Lobbying Activities and Expenditures, and we'll go over that a little bit more later. But clerical employees, so people that just make copies or answer phones, they don't need to keep track of their time as it relates to lobbying. Or individuals devoting less than 10 hours within a 6-month reporting period, those people don't need to keep track of their time. You still may want to have them take a look at it a little bit to make sure they're not going over the 10 hours. And then also unpaid volunteers, because again, the definition of a lobbyist is somebody that is being paid to engage in lobbying activity on behalf of a principal. So if someone's not getting paid, then they're not a lobbyist, they're just a volunteer, and they don't need to be keeping track of their time. And so as Colette talked about a little bit earlier, we have here, there's a difference in lobbying communications for the purposes of the threshold for obtaining a license versus your lobbyist time reports. And lobbyist time reports are for activity of efforts focused on attempting to influence legislative or administrative action, so specific to lobbying. So we have lobbying communications, so it's meeting directly with state officials, you're appearing at public hearings, you're having phone calls directly with perhaps legislators, legislative staff, as we discussed earlier, that conversational exchange of electronic messaging, so whether it be email or texting back and forth, but that back and forth dialogue, and then this excludes the de minimis amounts of time. So if you're sending out one communication via an email, but it's not conversational back and forth, technically the amount of time that you would need to report is the amount of time that it takes for you to click send. That's the actual communication action, and we don't require you to place that in your lobbying communications column of the lobbyist time report. But there are also hours other, so other lobbying related activities. This is the preparation and research that might go into something that you're doing before you actually communicate. This could be monitoring legislation, drafting letters and emails, internal meetings to talk about legislative strategy, compiling facts and analyzing data as it relates to your principal, and also preparing for grassroots lobbying. So if you have a lobbyist that is organizing a giant lobbying day event for your principal, the time that that lobbyist is spending to create that event, that grassroots lobbying event, could be included in the other lobbying related activity category of their time report. But again, if you have questions about where to put something, or you don't know if something is a lobbying communication or not, you can always call us, send us an email, and we will get to you as soon as we can, usually within the same day, unless you send us something at like 5 p.m. because we'll be out of the office. But I'd like to reiterate again for this, the lobbyist time reports focus on efforts that are going to attempting to influence legislative or administrative action. So if you're calling a legislator's office and you're simply scheduling a meeting, maybe that meeting is you're going to be talking about influencing legislative or administrative action, but simply calling to schedule that meeting is not a lobbying communication. If over the course of that scheduling you get into discussing the content and what your principal's positions are, even to the legislative aid, then it might be a lobbying communication. But in that scenario, if you are unsure, again, just contact us and we'll help you out.
And kind of on that same point, because we are going to start, and we are in a transition period with some state officials, that means that we are going to have a lot of lobbyists and state officials just having meet and greets. Those also are not lobbying communications, so it's nothing that we regulate and nothing that needs to be reported for us, as long as it's just that simple meet and greet, and this is who I am, this is who I represent, and not getting into legislative or administrative rulemaking.
And again, this is what the timesheet looks like. So we have a column for hours communicating and hours other. And we have a couple more scenarios to go through in terms of reporting. So in this scenario, a principal's lobbyist meets with a legislative aide to pursue drafting of legislation that would create, I used this example already, a tax exemption for cat food. And then there's budget drafting, so bill language gets included about that tax exemption, but it doesn't make it into the final budget. And then there's a standalone bill for the tax exemption for cat food. And throughout this whole process, the lobbyist is continually communicating with legislative staff. And so what reporting is required of the principal? So they need to report lobbying interests within 15 days of each time that it changes status. So changing from the budget to a standalone bill, or from just a general topic to going into the budget. If you're continually communicating, then after that topic kind of changes its status again, changes from being in the budget to being a standalone, you need to report a new 15-day report, a new report of lobbying interest, and that's due within 15 days of the initial communication. So our second scenario here, so on October 1st, there's a lobbyist that spends 2 hours putting together a presentation for why the legislature should pass a certain bill. And the next day, the lobbyist meets with board members for an hour to discuss their legislative strategy. And then on October 3rd, the lobbyist drafts a letter to the organization's members, reminding them of the upcoming election. And on October 4th, the lobbyist shares that presentation at separate meetings with 3 legislators for an hour at each meeting. And so in this scenario, the lobbyists should report their time as the following. For October 1st, because they are putting together the presentation, they're doing kind of prep work, that would be hours other on their time report. On October 2nd, they're spending an hour on legislative strategy, kind of doing some internal communication, and that would be hours other as well. On October 3rd, they don't report any time because the communication wasn't regarding lobbying. It wasn't talking about legislative or administrative action. It was talking about an election. And then on October 4th, we would say that would be 3 hours communicating. So, if you had an hour meeting with each of the legislators, that would be 3 hours directly communicating with them. But again, if you have any questions about how to report, give us a call. And finally, we'll go over the reporting requirements at the end of each reporting period. So the lobbyist time report, what we just talked about, the lobbyists should be keeping track of that as they're going through the reporting period, but it's not due until the end, actually 1 month after the reporting period ends. But the statement of lobbying activities and expenditures is due 1 month after the reporting period ends as well. So again, activity from January to June, so January 1st to June 30th is due on July 31st, and activity for July 1st to December 31st is due on January 31st. And these are all the different areas that the SLAE covers. So your subjects of lobbying from your 15-day reports, a reasonable estimate of a proportion of lobbying time for each bill, rule, topic that was reported, all the various expenditures, and then the identity of any non-lobbyist employees making lobbying communications over 10 hours, or making lobbying communications, and if they had activity of more than 10 hours regarding lobbying within the 6-month reporting period. And it's important here to note that when you're keeping track of all of this information and you're submitting it onto the lobbying website, that lobbying principals and lobbyists are required to maintain records, to retain their lobbying records for 3 years. So that's 3 years after the date of filing the expense statement. So say you file an SLAE on January 30th of 2016, you have to retain your own copy of those records for 3 years. So until January 30th of 2019, you would have to retain those records. It's very important in case any kind of complaints or investigations come up that you maintain those records so that you can reproduce them and have proof of, yes, we engaged in this lobbying activity, or no, we didn't. But it is required by statutes that you retain those records for 3 years after you filed the SLAE. And the SLAE is when you're going to be reporting time and money. And statutes require a reasonable estimate of lobbying expenditures made and a good faith effort to record daily information for reporting. And so that's why we say that de minimis amounts of time don't need to be included in the lobbyist time report because that would is not necessarily have to be included for a good faith effort. If you're trying to count like the seconds, that is kind of not necessary. If you're kind of just doing your best, giving us a reasonable estimate of how much money was spent and how much time was afforded for certain things, then you will be all good to go. It's important here to not artificially inflate your hours by including grassroots lobbying time. Now, as I discussed before, if your lobbyist is preparing for a big advocacy lobby day and they're spending a lot of their time doing that, that can be included in their hours other. But it shouldn't be included in the hours communicating for the lobbyist because the lobbyist wasn't actually communicating. And as I discussed a little bit earlier as well, volunteers are not paid and therefore are not lobbyists. So their time that they spend communicating should not go on the lobbyist time report. So again, don't artificially inflate those hours. But the expenses from grassroots organizing should be reported on your statement. A good example of this is the Transportation Development Association, TDA's Just Fix It campaign. They did a pretty big media campaign for this, and I think they did have a couple of different lobby days in a few different locations. But they reported it correctly because they didn't include the volunteers' time that they spent lobbying. They included the expenses that they spent on the media advertising and perhaps the transportation that they paid for and things like that to get those people to and from the places in which they were engaging in grassroots lobbying. But they didn't include the actual time because, again, the time that's included should only be the lobbyist's time. It's a lobbyist time report, not a volunteer time report. And so again, here, this is kind of what the homepage looks like for when you're filing your statement of lobbying activities and expenditures. And also, you can see these different portions here have kind of hyperlinks underneath them. If you click those, there will be more descriptions about how to fill out those particular portions, and we have reviewed those, so the information in them is updated. And you can see here, and this is just from our testing version of the website, but you can see the dates that the lobbyists certified their time reports. Your statement of lobbying activities and expenditures can't be submitted until all the lobbyists submit their time reports, so you can see a little summary of that here as well. And again, something new, as noted by the little blue box that we have here, is that we are not going to be listing in-house and contract for hours and payments when you're submitting the SLAE. It's just going to be one category of lobbyists because, again, statutorily, there isn't any notation for an in-house versus a contract. It only relies on that exclusive or duties exclusive to the statutory definition of lobbying. So you won't see in-house or contract here, but you'll still be entering the same information. It'll just be all in one column. And so following that a little bit more, and this will be made more clear. There is a sample SLAE later in the presentation. But so now if you have a in-house, if you have somebody that is employed by the lobbying principal, someone that works full-time for them is engaging in lobbying activity, they will be clearly noted as an employee of that organization. So the first blue box that you see on the time reporting sheet there would be the name of the employer. So if it's a lobbying firm, that lobbying firm would be listed, and then underneath that, as sort of a subsection, we'll list out the name of the lobbyists that either work for that firm or the lobbyists that are employed directly by the lobbying principal. And so now we'll get into a little bit the non-lobbyist time report. So it's a little bit complicated, but we'll try and make it as succinct as possible here. So all non-lobbyists and non-clerical employees that spent 10 or more hours during one reporting period on lobbying-related activities. And so this report is supposed to account for people that, maybe they assisted a lobbyist in prep work or doing research or something like that, but they didn't actually have 5 lobbying communications. But 10 hours is still a significant amount of time to engage in lobbying activity. So it's supposed to disclose the identity of those people, and also there's a portion on the SLAE for the principal to note how much they got paid. But you have to keep in mind that if you have someone that's assisting you very heavily in the area of lobbying, you have to keep special track of their communications. Because if they do have 5 communications, then they do have the same requirement as a general lobbyist does. With that 5 communications, because they're being paid, they're an employee of the principal, and they're having those 5 communications within a 6-month period, they need to get their license. So make sure anybody that's engaging in, doing a lot of research or assisting perhaps lobbyists on the job is keeping track of those communications that they have and keeping track of their time more generally. And so here's where you can see a little bit more clearly. This is what the new layout of the Statement of Lobbying Activities and Expenditures is going to look like. This is from our test website, so It is not anything, it's not actual real information. It's completely made up by staff here. But under the category of lobbyists, that first line would be the name of the employer. So perhaps it would be a lobbying firm. And then that second line, where the hours communicating are 32, would be the name of the lobbyist. And the next line down would be the name of the next employer. So maybe it's the principal here, which the principal's name in this scenario is new SLAE print layout test. And so that name, if they employed anybody directly, would be listed. And then the people that they employ directly, those lobbyists, would be listed under that principal's name. Again, it's a little bit harder to see here because we, marked them all out, but it will become more clear when you're actually submitting the information. And if you have any questions about it, or you're not sure what you're looking at when the time comes, which won't be until in July of next year, just give us a call and we'll be happy to talk you through it again. But it's important to note that the current layout for the SLAE with the references to contract and in-house will still be in existence for the rest of the reporting for this legislative session. So when you are submitting the next SLAE that is due on January 31st of 2019, covering activity from July 1st, 2018 to December 31st of 2018, it will still have the references to in-house and contract. So we have some more scenarios. There is a principal that's communicated on 2 different bills and 3 different topics during this July to December reporting period. It's now January 25th, and they're trying to fill out their SLAE before the deadline. Good job. But they don't have any legislative matters listed under their allocation of efforts portion of the SLAE. So what happened in this scenario? The principal didn't submit 15-day reports for each of the 5 different communications, 5 initial communications that occurred for legislative matters that they've been interested in. And so that's something that they should have been doing continually throughout the reporting period, so that when it gets time to report on the SLAE, their accurate allocation of effort, they have all of their various options listed. And so these 15-day reports actually would be considered late because they were submitted more than 15 days after the end of the last possible day to have had an initial communication on a legislative matter in the reporting period. So that would have been December 31st, would have been the last day to have an initial communication on something. I know hopefully none of you are working on New Year's Eve, but because it was submitted obviously not by January 15th or January 16th, they're outside of the 15-day window to have reported it in a timely manner. So not only did they report their 15-day reports, but if they can't figure this out in time, you might also have a late statement of lobbying activities and expenditures. So again, if you are looking at your reporting, you're not sure what you're looking at, or you think something's missing, give us a call. We're more than happy to just poke around to help you get a better idea of if you're missing anything or anything like that. So just give us a call. We have a pretty quick response time. And so the second scenario, there's a principal that employs 1 lobbyist from a law firm and 1 lobbyist that they employ full-time directly. And then a staff person that they employ directly that spends half of their full-time hours doing research and strategizing. So what info needs to go on their SLAE? And we have a little note here that the research staff member is never directly communicating with any legislators or legislative staff. So they're just doing kind of research and assisting the lobbyist that's employed directly. So on the SLAE, the lobbyist hours and expenses need to be included. So how much those lobbyists, the one from the law firm and the one that's directly employed, are getting paid, and then the time that they spent engaging in lobbying communications and hours of other activity. And then their allocation of effort. So that's based on, again, the 15-day reports, so they can put percentages in whatever areas they spent a lot of time on. And then also and it should be listed here, and I'm unsure why it's not, but that that employee that is spending half of their full-time hours conducting research and strategizing with the lobbyist, because that would be well over the 10 hours within a reporting period. Because if you're doing like 20 hours a week, that's already over the 10 hours right there. So her compensation, or his or her compensation, and the approximate amount of time that they spent conducting that research and strategizing would need to be included as well. And so going through this a little bit more, we do have 4 different standard settlement schedules. We have 4 different standard settlement schedules related to lobbying, and they are the late filing of the SLAE, the late reporting of 15-day reports, and late payment of lobbying-related fees, and unauthorized lobbying. Now, the 2 on the right are the newest ones. Those were approved at the February meeting earlier in 2018. And what I noted earlier regarding paying your fees on time is right here. So you have 15 days from submitting the application of your principal registration or your lobbyist license to get us the payment. If it's more than 15 days, you could, the commission could seek potential enforcement action and seek this settlement for not paying the fees in a timely manner. And we also have a brand new audit for unauthorized lobbying that relies on that that question on the lobbyist authorization portion of the principal registration. So when it's asking, are the lobbyist duties on behalf of this principal limited to or not limited to the statutory definition of lobbying? That's what we use here when we're trying to figure out if someone engaged in unauthorized lobbying or not. And so remember, when you're looking at the authorizations and that summary of the principles that you have authorized, and you can even see it from just looking at the public view of the website, you don't even have to log in. If your lobbyist doesn't have an authorization date, we don't have their fee, and they are not authorized to lobby on behalf of you. They should not be engaging in lobbying activity potentially at all, or, more than the 5 communications within the 6 months. And just a small example, because we get this question a lot when we do the audit for late 15-day reports regarding how we calculate the settlements. So if we have a principal who has had their second occurrence within 3 years of reporting 15-day reports late, and then their 2 bills in 3 topics collectively constitute 60% of their total effort, then here's how we calculate it. We kind of go from left to right on the table. It's their second occurrence of reported interest, and it was over 10% of their total effort. So it's $100 per interest. So we end up with $500. So it's very important for you to submit those 15-day reports on time in a timely manner. So just do it continually every time you're having an initial communication.
Okay, so Caroline just went through what lobbyists and principals are required to do. I'm going to go through what lobbyists and principals should not be doing. So certain restrictions are laid out in the lobbying statutes. There's one broad prohibition that is important to know, and that is that no lobbyist or principal may give anything of value to an elected state official, candidate for state elective office, legislative employee, or agency official. There are some exceptions, but generally, overall, this means that you cannot be giving anything of value if you are a lobbyist or if you are a principal to a state official. And when I say state official, that includes all those types of officials that are listed in that statutory citation. This is different, and it can get confused with the ethics code. The lobbying law is a stricter prohibition than what the ethics code has. Businesses or individuals that are not lobbyists or principals, maybe in certain circumstances allowed to give items of value to or services of value to state officials if the state official reimburses that, or there's some other exceptions within the ethics code. But for this training, we're just going over the prohibitions within the lobbying statutes. So just of note is that unlike with the ethics code, if a lobbyist or principal wants to give something to a state official, it's not even okay if the state official reimburses that. So that's not an exception. It does not negate the prohibition, the general prohibition against giving anything of value. With most restrictions that are in our statutes, there are exceptions. So one main exception is if a service or item of value is available to the general public. We have specific elements that need to be met when you consider if something is available to the general public. So that means if it is available to anyone that wants it or is qualified for it, that there is no preferential treatment, and that there's no preferential notice or advantage to the official. If you, for example, if you are sending invites out to officials for a event that is open to the public, or an item or service that's being provided and it's open to the general public, you should make sure that you've already noticed the general public rather than sending that notice out to state officials. That advance notice would be a preferential treatment. That wouldn't qualify for this exception then. Another exception is campaign contributions. So lobbyists may make personal campaign contributions to a partisan elected official or a candidate for partisan state office from the first day that the candidates are allowed to start circulating nomination papers through the election day, whether it be a regular or a special election. A lobbyist also can make personal contribution to a legislator, but that only is if they are not in a general or a normal legislative session or a special or extraordinary session. So that you have that extra layer here if you get into a legislator rather than just a partisan elected official. Some things to watch out for with this are if you are giving contributions through a conduit, those are your personal contributions, so you have to authorize them. Just make sure that your conduit administrator knows that there is this window, and that if you authorize it within this window, to make sure that they are sending that contribution off to the candidate or the committee that you're giving it to within that window, so we don't have your contribution accidentally come up in a audit and you actually meant for it to be within the window. So if you are giving through conduits, it's always good to make sure you are physically or having physical documentation of when you gave that and when you authorized that contribution to be made through the conduit. Again, we've stressed this, if you're a limited principal lobbyist, you still are subject to these restrictions. And be careful, because if your authorization has been withdrawn and you still have your license, that means you're still a licensed lobbyist. So just be careful for that too. If you have stopped lobbying for a principal, that's a good time to make sure you check with the principal to see if they withdrew your authorization and if you want to get rid of your license or not.
And also something to note here that this is a narrow exception. The broad prohibition is that lobbyists can't give contributions to partisan elected officials or candidates for partisan office at all. And the exception is this narrow window between circulating nominations papers, and the general election or special election day, with that added layer of not being in session for legislators. But it's important to note here that contributions to candidates for local and nonpartisan office aren't allowed if that candidate is currently holding partisan office. So if you have a perhaps state assembly person or senator that is running for mayor, mayor is a nonpartisan office, and this exception only applies to candidates for partisan office. So that means that you can't give any contributions, even inside of the window, to a incumbent partisan legislator that is running for a nonpartisan office. But if you're unsure about any of these scenarios, just give us a call and we can walk you through it. We've probably got the same question before if you're talking about a specific person or a specific race, and we'd be more than happy to share with you the same advice.
And just of note for the upcoming spring elections, that period is going to start on December 1st to April 2nd. Candidates can start circulating their nomination papers on December 1st, and the election will be held on April 2nd. So that is... So several other exceptions, and there are some more than this in statutes, but they're very specific and fact-based. So if you do come across any of those, please give us a call if you have questions about those. Reimbursement to elected state officials is an exception that is kind of a crossover exception that's contained in both the lobbying statute and it references to the ethics code. So you can reimburse state officials that are presenting at seminars or conferences. You can reimburse their expenses, their reasonable expenses. For example, if you have a state official coming to talk at a seminar and it's held over a lunch hour or dinner hour, and then you can have that state official accept the meal and reimburse them for any expenses related to their presentation. Just make sure that this is actually a presentation or a speaker that is listed on some kind of agenda. They're not just getting up and talking, answering questions that might be posed. It has to be something that they were scheduled for, pretty much. Another exception is giving informational materials that are not of substantial value. So this is kind of getting back to if you are just answering questions about information from state officials, you're certainly free to give whatever informational materials they are requesting. You're allowed to give informational materials like monthly newsletters that are just talking about your organization and what you're doing, as long as that's not an attempt to influence legislation. And also giving items or services of value to a relative or member of the same household. So if we have spouses, that one is state official, one is lobbying, lobbyist, then they can share that compensation. That's not considered prohibited. And
they can give each other Christmas gifts.
Yes.
As long as it's reported on their statement of economic interest as it's over $50. But that's a different thing. And something that we get asked about a lot, Colette, do you want to talk about the just the reimbursing for meals again, like the example of like getting a beer at the old-fashioned?
Yeah, so getting back to kind of how strict the lobbying law is versus the ethics code. If you are friends with a legislative employee and you're a lobbyist, really under the statutes, you should not be buying them a beer after work. That is considered giving something of value, and that kind of stresses how strict that the lobbying statutes are when it comes to exchanging items of value. Even if you're being reimbursed, it's not allowed under the lobbying statutes. So don't confuse that with the ethics code. That's a little more lenient in certain circumstances.
So everybody has to buy their own beer.
And that is it for restrictions. Like I said, there are more listed in the statutes, but these are the main ones that generally come up most of the time.
And the biggest theme of this presentation, of this kind of training webinar, if you have any questions about it, if you think like an exception may apply to you as the lobbyist or the principal in the current situation or scenario that you're thinking about doing, it's always better to contact us in advance before the event or activity takes place. Because we can give you kind of a definitive answer. Yes, you can do that. No, you can't. Or we need to seek the advice of the commission itself. It's very important that you contact us way far in advance, especially if it's something that might be a little bit more complicated, because we may have to get the advice of the commission, and that could take a couple of months. For instance, our next commission meeting is on December 11th, but after that, the commission doesn't meet until March of 2019. And so the sooner you contact us, the sooner we can get you a very definitive answer, perhaps with legal protections, that will ensure you can do whatever activity that you're wanting to do, or let you know that it is prohibited. And so our last sort of portion of this is to go over the noteworthy changes that I've tried to note, Colette and I have tried to note throughout this presentation. We have them summarized here. So for the lobbyist authorizations, we have that new question of the duties agreed upon by the principal and the lobbyist, whether or not their duties are exclusive or not exclusive to lobbying as defined by statute. So lobbying as in attempting to influence legislative or administrative action. And then the lobbyist type removal from all of the screens within the website. There should be no more references to in-house and contract lobbyists. And then the authorization for the lobbyist will only be approved, and the authorization for the lobbyist will only have an authorization date after the authorization fee has been paid. So staff members here at the commission will be approving those only when we receive payment. And then also we have a little bit of a change to the fringe and overhead calculations that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So again, the duties agreed upon by the principal and the lobbyist. This is super important that lobbyists and principals have this conversation. Who's going to be answering this question? What the correct answer is? Talk about it with your lobbyists, what their duties are going to be, to make sure that you're choosing the appropriate question. So if the lobbyist does have duties other than just attempting to influence legislative or administrative action, you would choose that second bullet. But if they're only attempting to influence legislative or administrative action, then you choose the first one. And again, on those pages with that question, you will have this text to assist you. And we have the lobbyist type removal, so you will no longer see the in-house and contract lobbyist hours and payments, and you will not see in-house or contract listed when you're looking at the listing of authorized lobbyists. And the date of the authorization will be blank if the fee has not been paid. There will be no date of authorization if we have not received and approved the lobbyist authorization. So keep an eye on that, especially going into when registration opens on December 1st, which is Saturday, December 1st of 2018. Because as you're going through and doing this, if you're not sure, if you thought that somebody sent a check-in but there's still no date, you can always call us too, and we can look at our records to make sure. Get in contact with your principal if you think you were supposed to be authorized and you're not for some reason. And so something that I didn't quite touch on as much as I wanted to for the statement of lobbying activities and expenditures is the fringe and overhead calculations. So fringe benefits will not be a part of the statement of lobbying activities and expenditures beginning with the next session. All of these noteworthy changes will be starting with the registration for the new session. So only for the 2019 to 2020 session moving forward. The current reporting will stay the same. And then as soon as we get into reporting for the next session, it will be new. But fringe benefits, any money that are paid for like healthcare, dental costs for benefits to a lobbyist should be included in their payments to lobbyists portion of the SLAE. So, if a principal directly employs a lobbyist and they pay something for their healthcare costs, that should be included in the cost of the salary that they're putting in the expenditures portion of the SLAE. Fringe benefits is no longer going to be on there. It is not directly referred to in statutes, and it is technically considered a part of the salary, so the payments attributable to lobbyists and lobbying. And then also, at the moment, any overhead costs are calculated automatically, and this is something I think that was implemented with the when the lobbying website was brand new. And they were automatically calculated at like 30% of the salary attributable to lobbying. But in looking forward to a brand new lobbying website, we were reviewing the statutes and making sure that we're aligned as closely as possible with them. And there wasn't really any reference to why overhead costs would be at like 30% of fringe and salary. And so now, instead of being automatically calculated, overhead cost is going to be 0 unless it's manually changed. So if your principal does list overhead costs or relied on that automatic calculation, make sure that you are putting the correct amount of overhead costs on the SLAE, because it's not going to manually be updated there. You actually have to physically put it in. And so on the left here, you can see you would click the Calculate Overhead button, and it would bring you to the screen on the right, where you could enter in, if it was for office space or books or, security and things like that, and you could enter in the amount and save it, and it will get displayed on the SLAE. If you have any questions about these changes, please contact us. Please let us know if you're unsure about something. We'd be more than happy to walk you through it again, or in a little bit more detail if that's something that you would like. And just lastly, before we end, I want to talk a little bit about Focus, which is an email subscription service that the Ethics Commission provides that can email you directly with customizable lobbying information. And it costs $100 per legislative session. And you can choose specific criteria, and the lobbying website will send you an email every time there's a new lobbying activity on that criteria. So for instance, staff members here have criteria set for like lobbyist licenses. So if there's any legislation or any lobbying activity on legislation having to do with lobbyist licenses, we'll get an email notification as soon as it's up in the legislature's website. You can also subscribe to specific principals activity. So if you want to keep an eye on a particular principal and see what they're doing, potentially every time there's a 15-day report that is submitted by that principal, you can get emailed about it. And here's what it looks like. We are going to be looking at updating the kind of look of it along with the new lobbying website moving forward. And then some frequent mistakes to avoid. Something that we see a lot is not abiding by the steps 1 through 4 when you're going through licensing and registering. If you do follow this order, you will have all of the appropriate fees for your different scenarios. But, if you're going to authorize your lobbyist, but the lobbyist hasn't submitted their license application yet, their name isn't even going to show up for you to be able to authorize. And then, that means you'll have to go back at some point and add them. And there's just more opportunity for error there. So just follow these steps 1 through 4. And again, as we discussed earlier, is the permissions, the principal and lobbyist permissions. If you have people that are going to be entering information, perhaps support staff or something, you can set them up with their own username and give them permissions to enter that information. It's very important because there are legal implications for the documents, the legal documents that you're submitting through the lobbying website. The lobbyist time report is a legal document. The SLAE is a legal document. And if someone has logged into the Ion Lobbying system using your username, your name is the one that has signed the electronic signature and certified that information. So if that information is incorrect, you would be the one legally implicated by that. Or if there's an error, we don't know who to contact if we contact you and you have no idea what we're talking about because you didn't submit the report. Also, don't make a new user account if you can't log in. That happens all the time. A decent part of my job when I first started here in April of 2017 was to get rid of duplicate accounts, because when folks couldn't log in, they would just make a new one, or they wouldn't understand why they didn't have access to do certain things under their account, but it turns out that they just created a new one and didn't have any of the principal permissions and things like that. Also, don't wait until the deadline to submit your reports. This goes for SLAEs or 15-day reports. And then if you want to withdraw lobbyist authorization or surrender your license, you can go ahead and give us a call. As Colette stated earlier, technically, if you still have a lobbyist license, even though you might be withdrawn, your authorization might be withdrawn from engaging in lobbying activity for a principal, your license is still valid. So you still have the prohibitions on making personal contributions and giving things of value to candidates and things like that. So give us a call to make sure, or if you're not sure if you're surrendered or you did everything right, give us a call and we can make sure that everything is in order. And if you are viewing this presentation online, you can actually view the PowerPoint itself, and these links will all go directly to the resources section or about lobbying in Wisconsin sections of our website, or the FAQs and the advisory opinions as well. But you can always contact us if you are unsure where to look for something, or you don't know if your situation is permitted or not. So just give us a call and we would be more than happy to help you out. And before we end, I just want to note that we do have a project right now going on. We are in the middle of completely redoing the lobbying website. We're going to be making it mobile friendly. We're updating the aesthetics of it and some usability aspects of it. And we are aiming to have it done by summer of 2019. We've done a lot of sort of usability testing with people in the community, with lobbyists themselves, working with the Association of Wisconsin Lobbyists to make sure that we're getting a really good product that is going to help the regulated community give us the most accurate information and help them remain compliant regarding the lobbying law, so that we can have all this information made available to the public and made easy to understand for them. So it's a very exciting project. And so moving forward, we'll have lots of training in 2019 before those things are launched, and we'll have lots of materials for you guys. But that's just something that's in the works from us here at the Ethics Commission. And here's our contact information. We're always available for phone calls, sending us an email. If you have a very specific scenario, I definitely recommend sending an email, because more than likely we'll have to follow up with you, and the information or the advice that we give it has a little bit more legal protection if we have that paper trail of information that was exchanged between us and between you. And as long as you are working within the advice that we gave you, you do have that legal protection. But that legal protection only exists for your specific scenario if you contact us via email. So, if one lobbying principal or one lobbyist contacted us about something, and they tell you that, oh yeah, what you're doing is fine because I asked the Ethics Commission and they said it was okay, that might not be the case. If we gave them advice, staff advice, it is probably only specific to their scenario, and you should call to get your own advice.
And another note on advice is that just an email from staff or an informal opinion will not provide complete legal protection. If you want that, it's required that you can request a formal opinion of the commission that is going to be looked at by staff, drafted by the administrator, and staff council, and approved by the commission. So it offers the most legal protection. But we are here for all your more kind of simple and easy questions, especially ones that already have a basis in statute or administrative rule and current opinions.
And when you contact us with your questions, our responses and the information that you give us, it does remain confidential. So we don't really talk about our work very often outside of work, because most of what we're doing is answering questions on the phone from folks that is very detail specific, and it is confidential. It contains confidential information. So we're not going to share the information that you give us with anybody on the phone. We'll only talk about it internally if we need to kind of discuss what the answer might be.
Another point of confidentiality is any audits that we may contact you about. That all remains confidential, and any settlements until they're actually signed and agreed upon. Once those are signed by both parties, they are allowed to be released to the public. We don't publish them right now, but we might get public records requests for them. But before that happens, any audit proceedings or investigation proceedings all remain confidential as well. So we are here to help, and we're not going to judge, and we would rather have your questions come to us rather than have to take any enforcement action.
All right, we hope that this presentation sort of webinar was had a lot of useful information for you. And again, if you have any other questions, just give us a call and we'd be happy to help.